The search for two missing children in Nova Scotia resumes today, nearly a month after they disappeared. 4-year-old Jack Sullivan and his 6-year-old sister Lily were reported missing on May 2nd. They were last seen at their home in rural Lansdowne Station, about 140 kilometres northeast of Halifax. Police say approximately 75 volunteers joined search in the area near where the children lived and where a small boot print was found during an earlier search. Rescue officials say there's been no evidence since the search was suspended on May 17th.
6-year-old Lily Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack were reported missing from their home in rural Nova Scotia. Within hours, that quiet home on Gearlock Road became the center of one of the most intense and puzzling searches in recent Canadian history. What followed was a series of contradictions, conflicting timelines, and unanswered questions that quickly shifted the focus from search to investigation. More than 160 trained professionals searched the surrounding forests. Drones scanned the landscape. Helicopters hovered overhead. Tracking dogs were deployed. But days passed, and not a single trace of Lily or Jack was found. Not even a footprint. As the search expanded, the silence around the truth grew louder. This was not a case of children lost in the woods. It was a case that exposed deeper failures of communication, of oversight, and of response. The system that should have protected them didn't react fast enough. By the time urgency set in, it was already too late. Before we begin, please note this case involves sensitive material that some may find upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's return to the moment everything changed. On the morning of May 2nd, 2025, in the isolated community of Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia, the official search for 6-year-old Lily Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack began. But questions surrounding their disappearance had started forming days earlier. Lily and Jack were last seen by their school on April 29th. It was a Tuesday. Their bus driver dropped them off at the end of the long, wooded driveway leading to the family's trailer on Gearlock Road. That was the last time they were seen by someone outside the household. Wednesday, April 30th was a scheduled professional development day. No classes were held. That part checked out. But what followed didn't. On Thursday, May 1st, the children were not sent back to school. According to the mother, Lily had developed a cough, and both she and Jack were kept home as a precaution. This reason would later be repeated by both caregivers, but investigators noted no documented illness or contact with a physician. No neighbor, visitor, or independent source could confirm having seen the children that day, except for one relative, whose account was never corroborated. As the hours and days passed, the timeline narrowed, and trust in its accuracy began to fray. The official disappearance was reported on May 2nd, a Friday. According to the mother, she woke up sometime around 8 a.m. She described hearing the children playing in the next room. At some point between 8 a.m. and 8:20 a.m., she claimed the house fell quiet. She said she got out of bed and noticed the children were gone. The stepfather added that Lily had been coming in and out of the bedroom earlier that morning, while Jack was allegedly making noise in the kitchen. But by the time they realized the silence, both children were missing. They reported searching the house and nearby woods before calling for help. The 911 call was placed around 10 a.m., a full hour and a half after the children were last supposedly heard. That gap between the moment the house went quiet and the time emergency services were notified was never clearly explained. And it would become one of the first critical inconsistencies in a case built on shifting details. Another key issue was what the children were wearing. Daniel Martel, the children's stepfather, described Lily's outfit in specific detail, down to a pink shirt and a white backpack with red strawberries. He also stated Jack was wearing blue boots with dinosaurs. But when pressed later, He admitted he hadn't seen Jack that morning at all. It raised a question that investigators would ask again and again. How could he describe the clothing of a child he hadn't seen? The timeline wasn't the only thing drawing scrutiny. So did the nature of the response. An Amber Alert was never issued. Instead, the RCMP classified the case under the Vulnerable Missing Persons Advisory. That meant there were concerns for the children's safety, but the criteria for a full alert, typically requiring confirmation of an abduction, had not been met. The choice sparked backlash and confusion, particularly from members of the Sepeknekatik First Nation, to which Lily and Jack belonged. Questions were raised about how alert protocols are applied and whether race, remoteness, or assumptions played a role in how urgently the case was treated. What began as a missing persons report was quickly evolving into something more complex. The hours after the disappearance revealed more than just a loss. They exposed a timeline full of holes, a family's story riddled with contradictions, and a growing sense that the truth was not as straightforward as first believed. The Sullivan family lived at the edge of Gearlock Road, in a remote section of Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. Their home was a white trailer surrounded by thick woods, scattered children's toys, and rusting debris. The nearest town was a 15-minute drive over unpaved roads. There was no cell phone service in the area, no internet. The family lived almost completely cut off from the outside world. Inside that trailer lived 27-year-old Malaya Brooks Murray, her partner, 33-year-old Daniel Martell, and their 3 children. Lily, 6, and Jack, 4, were Malaya's children from a previous relationship. Meadow, just 16 months old, was the daughter of Malaya and Daniel. Malaya was a member of the Sepeknekatik First Nation, the largest Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. But in recent years, she had distanced herself from her roots. By moving in with Daniel in rural Lansdowne Station, she had left behind her extended family, her cultural connections, and the support structures of her community. It was a shift that raised concern among some who knew her, moving from a tightly knit Indigenous network to near total isolation in a predominantly white rural area. Daniel Martell had grown up in Lansdowne Station. He lived in his childhood home, the same trailer where the children would eventually go missing. On the same property, just a few feet away, was a second trailer where Daniel's mother lived. That space was described by searchers and locals as worn down and cluttered. Reports from those involved in the search effort noted the presence of multiple animals, cats, and at least one dog, living in cramped conditions. It added to the perception of a property in disrepair, surrounded by dense woods that could obscure sight lines even in daylight. Daniel worked at a nearby lumber mill, but according to his own accounts and statements given to media, he only worked 1 day per week. It's not clear how the family was financially supporting itself beyond that. No government benefits or employment subsidies were publicly confirmed, and Daniel never gave a detailed explanation when asked. The question of how a family of 5 living in near isolation was managing on a 1-day-a-week job only deepened concerns after the children disappeared. Despite the conditions at home, Lily and Jack were known in the local school system. They had recently been enrolled at Salt Springs Elementary, a small rural school with just under 90 students. Their bus driver, Brian Ward, remembered them well. He described Lily as spirited and expressive, often excited during morning drop-offs. Jack, he said, was playful and energetic. Staff at the school confirmed they were adjusting well, with no formal concerns documented prior to the disappearance. However, there were differing accounts about the children's communication and behavior. Within the family, it was said that both Lily and Jack had undiagnosed developmental concerns, Yet this wasn't supported by school observations. Teachers noted they were sometimes quiet, but socially typical. A relative from the children's paternal side described them as largely nonverbal, a contrast to the bus driver's recollection of lively chatter. These discrepancies would later add to the confusion investigators faced when trying to piece together who these children were and what might have made them vulnerable. The trailer itself was modest in size. The kitchen was small, with children's drawings taped to the walls. Photos taken later by media showed signs of play crayon art, a small backpack and toys visible in the grass just outside the door. But what stood out most to searchers and neighbors was not the warmth of a family home, but how exposed it was to the woods, and how detached the household had become from the broader community. In a place where people typically looked out for each other, the Sullivan household had few regular visitors. That seclusion, paired with the lack of a reliable phone signal, would later complicate efforts to confirm basic facts about the family's day-to-day life. In the critical hours before the children were reported missing, no one outside the home had seen or spoken to them. No one nearby could say with certainty what life looked like inside that trailer. The only accounts came from the adults living there, and from the moment the investigation began, those accounts would come under increasing scrutiny. The morning of May 2nd set in motion one of the largest search efforts ever seen in rural Nova Scotia. From the moment Lily and Jack Sullivan were reported missing, the response escalated rapidly. Over the next several days, more than 160 trained personnel were deployed each day to comb the area surrounding the family's property in Lansdowne Station. This was not a routine search. It became a full-scale mobilization. Amy Hansen, a certified search and rescue leader with years of experience in ground coordination, was tasked with overseeing operations. She and her team designed a precise GPS grid spanning more than 5 square kilometers of dense woodland. The terrain was unforgiving. Large portions of the forest had been damaged by the remnants of Hurricane Fiona the previous year. Fallen trees, heavy underbrush, and unstable ground made progress slow and exhausting. Even trained dogs struggled with footing. Rainfall had turned many paths into thick, muddy tracks. Despite this, the teams pressed forward. Air support was brought in almost immediately. Helicopters flew overhead in repeated sweeps. Drones were launched with thermal imaging equipment, searching for heat signatures. On the ground, canine units were led through wooded trails, drainage ditches, and along the edge of the property. Divers were called in to inspect water sources nearby, including ponds and creeks that cut through the forest. Nothing was overlooked. At one point, a single boot print was discovered in a mossy section of the woods approximately 300 meters from the home. The area was quickly cordoned off and analyzed. The impression appeared small, possibly consistent with a child's foot, but after further investigation, it yielded nothing conclusive. No follow-up tracks were found in any direction. It was the only physical clue recovered throughout the entire operation, and it led nowhere. No shoes, no backpack, no signs of diapers, snacks, or toys. Not a single belonging confirmed to have belonged to Lily or Jack was ever recovered. Even in remote disappearances, items are typically found: scattered clothing, a toy, a footprint trail. But in this case, there was only absence. It became a signature of the investigation, a void where evidence should be. As the days passed, the urgency remained, but the outlook dimmed. The scale of the operation and the resources dedicated to it drew attention across the province. Multiple search agencies collaborated with local RCMP, fire services, and volunteer units. Residents from neighboring communities joined the effort, many walking the rough terrain for hours, hoping for a sign. But by May 7th, 5 days after the disappearance, the search was officially scaled back. Statements released by authorities cited the lack of findings and the risk to searchers navigating unstable ground. Though fewer personnel remained, aerial surveillance and occasional targeted efforts continued through May 18. After that, all coordinated search operations were suspended. For the community, the silence was unsettling. People who had volunteered their time, who had expected something, anything to be found, were left with only questions. Experienced searchers quietly admitted that they had never seen anything like it. In most cases, even under difficult conditions, some evidence emerges. Here, there was nothing. It didn't feel like a case of children lost in the woods. It felt like they had vanished before ever reaching them. That sense of emptiness would come to define the early stages of the investigation, and it's what made the case so hard to understand. From the outset, discrepancies in the timeline raised concern. The parents initially said the children vanished sometime between 8 a.m. and 8:20 a.m. in the morning on May 2nd. But when pressed further, exact times became unclear. Statements changed. The order in which the children were last seen shifted depending on who was speaking. Daniel Martell, the stepfather, mentioned hearing the children in the morning, but later admitted he never physically saw Jack that day. Instead, he described sounds and movement, not direct contact. That distinction mattered. Investigators noted these contradictions and began looking more closely at communications within the home. Phones belonging to both Malaya Brooks-Murray and Daniel Martell were seized. Their digital history, including GPS tracking, Google searches, call records, and banking activity, was downloaded and reviewed. Although the RCMP did not immediately release details from those findings, the seizure itself signaled that law enforcement was no longer treating the case as an open-field disappearance. Daniel's behavior also drew scrutiny. He voluntarily offered to take a polygraph test, but when asked to clarify why, he told reporters he wanted to clear his name because he felt the public was turning against him. During one interview, he made a statement that caught attention. "I just hope they find something." It was subtle, but investigators noted the phrasing. Not, "I hope they find them," just something. In cases like this, word choice often becomes part of the broader pattern investigators watch for. Meanwhile, the RCMP was dealing with its own internal missteps. On the 11th day of the investigation, the agency released a media bulletin intended to renew public interest in the search, but Lily's name was misspelled in the document. What was meant to be a rallying moment instead turned into criticism. Families, advocates, and online commentators questioned the RCMP's attention to detail. For a case already struggling with answers, this mistake didn't help. Public tips poured in. Over 355 contacts were received by investigators within the first 2 weeks. More than 50 formal interviews were conducted with relatives, neighbors, and school personnel. Still not a single confirmed sighting of the children surfaced after May 1st. No one could independently verify having seen Lily or Jack alive after that day. As the investigation deepened, the family dynamic began to change. Tensions between Malaya and Daniel became noticeable. By the 3rd week of May, Malaya left the Gerlach Road property and took the youngest child, Meadow, with her. She later changed her relationship status on social media and deleted earlier posts referencing the search, and observers noticed. The deeper investigators looked, the more fragmented the story became. It wasn't just the absence of evidence that raised flags, it was the absence of cohesion in the narrative itself. The search had ended, but the investigation was just beginning to uncover how little anyone outside that trailer really knew. As media coverage expanded, so did public scrutiny. In the early stages of the investigation, both Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray participated in interviews and released statements to reporters.
When we noticed that the children were gone, immediately jumped in the vehicle, surveyed all the areas, many dirt roads, many culverts as I could, and waited for the police to get there.
Within days of the children being reported missing, the couple began using past tense when referring to Lily and Jack. In one on-camera interview, Daniel described Lily's favorite backpack. He recalled it as white, with red strawberries, but added, "It's probably brown now," referring to how it may have looked after days outdoors. While seemingly offhand, this phrasing didn't go unnoticed. To some, it suggested a shift from hope to resignation that had come unusually fast. The couple also appeared calm, composed, and well-presented in each appearance. No visible distress, no hesitation in interviews. They were clear-spoken, confident, but in cases involving missing children, extreme composure often prompts questions. Experts in behavioral analysis noted the disconnect between the gravity of the situation and the emotional restraint shown publicly. The community began to take notice. Neighbors and online observers pointed out what they felt was an absence of urgency. There were no mass printouts of flyers, no visible efforts to coordinate local search groups by the family themselves. While not uncommon in some missing persons cases, the contrast between public expectation and the family's low profile only fueled doubt. On local social media pages, discussions grew first about the timeline, then about behavior. While no direct accusations were made, the undertone was shifting. Former police detective and criminology professor Michael Arnfield described the case as statistically unusual. In his words, the complete absence of physical evidence, paired with early inconsistencies in the narrative, placed this incident in a category that required heightened scrutiny. Steve Ryan, another retired officer turned analyst, noted the public's growing discomfort. "People can sense when something feels off," he said. "This is one of those times." Online comparisons followed. The case of Summer Wells, a child who vanished from rural Tennessee under equally vague circumstances, was frequently referenced. Others drew parallels to the Chris Watts case, noting how early public statements in that case also raised quiet alarm bells that later proved to be justified. These associations were not made by law enforcement, but the public discourse surrounding the case was growing louder by the day. In response, the RCMP issued a formal warning under the Nova Scotia Cyber Protection Act. The statement advised the public against spreading unverified claims or targeted accusations. Officials emphasized that the investigation remained active and that speculation, especially online, could interfere with the process or unfairly damage reputations. The advisory didn't name individuals but was clearly aimed at managing the rapidly forming narratives across digital platforms. Still, public perception had begun to solidify. The strange quiet from the search site, the absence of visible emotion, the calm wording. In a case defined by what wasn't found, the behavior of those closest to the children was becoming a focus in its own right. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. As days passed with no progress in the search for Lily and Jack Sullivan, attention began shifting to not just the family or the investigation, but to the systems that were supposed to respond. In particular, one question came up again and again. Why wasn't an Amber Alert issued? From the start, the RCMP classified the disappearance as a vulnerable missing persons case. This meant the children were considered at risk, but the situation didn't meet all the criteria for an Amber Alert. To trigger one in Nova Scotia, there must be confirmation of an abduction, a detailed description of the child, and a suspect or vehicle. In this case, authorities said that threshold was not met. But the absence of an alert quickly became a point of controversy, especially among Indigenous leaders. Lily and Jack were members of the Sepeknikatik First Nation. Chief Michelle Glasgow spoke out publicly on May 7th, questioning why the alert system couldn't adapt to evolving circumstances. She pointed to a larger issue: the frequent delay or absence of urgent response in cases involving Indigenous children. The family had been living in a rural, predominantly white community far removed from their cultural support networks. This kind of isolation is not unusual for Indigenous families in Eastern Canada, but it can have serious consequences. The lack of cultural liaisons, trauma-informed officers, or Indigenous representation within the investigation created what some described as a disconnect. Community urgency wasn't mirrored in institutional action. Critics argued that if the children had belonged to a more visible or connected household, the initial response might have been different. It wasn't just about one alert, it was about a pattern. A recurring failure to respond swiftly and effectively when the children in question come from marginalized communities. Following coverage by major media outlets after May 7th, political pressure began to mount. Activists and educators called for a review of emergency response protocols. While the RCMP maintained their adherence to standard policy, the public was left with a lingering question. When children go missing, should the criteria be this rigid, or should common sense and urgency take priority? What unfolded in the case of Lily and Jack wasn't just a disappearance. It became a reflection of larger gaps, cultural, geographic, and systemic, that continue to affect vulnerable families across Canada. Lily and Jack were in the care of people they knew, people who claimed to love them. Yet within the safety of their own home, something went wrong, and no one noticed until it was too late. There were no formal warning signs, no calls to child services, no reports of concern from teachers or neighbors in the days before. And that's what makes this case so difficult to process. The danger, if it existed, didn't announce itself. It blended in with daily life. This reality points to a difficult but necessary truth. Risk doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, especially in isolated households where outside contact is limited. The space for concern narrows. That's why regular check-ins from schools, extended family, and community groups are so important. It's not about suspicion, it's about connection. Small changes in behavior, routines, or communication can mean more than they appear. Trusting those instincts and creating spaces where concerns can be voiced without judgment are critical. Prevention isn't just institutional, it's personal, it's community-driven. When children go missing from homes others thought were safe, it forces all of us to look closer not just at systems, but at how we stay involved in each other's lives. What's known is painfully limited. Lily and Jack Sullivan were reported missing on May 2, 2025. Their last confirmed sighting came days earlier, yet no one outside the home saw or spoke to them after May 1st. A massive search uncovered no evidence. A major crimes investigation revealed contradictions but no resolution. Phones were seized, timelines were scrutinized, interviews were conducted, and still no definitive answers. What remains unknown casts the longest shadow. No one has publicly explained the timeline gaps. No confirmed witness has seen the children in the crucial 48 hours before the report. No belongings surfaced during the search. No person has been charged or cleared. Every detail seemed to raise more questions than it answered. And as weeks turned into months, the case stood still. But perhaps the most haunting part of this case isn't just the silence. It's the system's quiet response. Lily and Jack didn't just vanish from a home. They vanished from a framework that didn't respond quickly enough when nothing appeared urgently wrong. There were no raised alarms, no emergency alerts, no institutional checks in place to catch the absence before it became permanent. This case revealed how easily concern can be delayed when isolation masks risk. How families, especially those living on the edge of community visibility, can fall through the cracks, and how the systems we trust to protect children are often reactive, waiting for confirmation of danger rather than acting at the first sign of something missing. If you followed this far, thank you. Your time, your attention, and your willingness to stay informed make a difference. Every comment, every share, every voice that refuses to let these children fade from public memory. That's what keeps cases like this alive, in the search for truth and justice. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and let us know where you're watching in the comments section, because every time someone hears a story like this, we get one step closer to making sure it never happens again. Your support helps uncover hidden truths and spread awareness to protect others. If there are any major updates on this case, I'll make another video to keep you informed. In the meantime, let's keep the conversation respectful, thoughtful, and focused on what truly matters, supporting efforts that ensure children are seen, heard, and protected before it's too late.